Well, the project that we had here at CIGI was one where we had 12 experts in 12 think tanks in 12 G20 countries observe 3 summits, the one in London, the one in L'Aquila, and the one in Pittsburgh, through the lens of the national newspapers and capitals of those countries to see how the leader performed in each of those 3 summits in terms of advancing the economic interests of the country, advancing the geopolitical position of the country, in terms of conveying to its public a sense of the concerted global effort that was involved. So what we got out of this was a surprising, given the simplicity of the methodology, was a surprisingly strong sense of the importance of leadership, of national political leadership, and of communications between the leader and the public in this moment in which the economic crisis is part of a political crisis of lack of trust in leaders and a loss of faith in institutions. So what we, I think, learned from this, this experiment in observing summits, over 3 summits in 12 countries, was that political leadership is really a vital part of making Summitry work. And I think we are doing this project with the Koreans, as you said, for their summit as well as the Canadian summit. And we are going to be conveying to them the importance of getting other countries beyond themselves to be aware in the run-up to the November summit in Korea, a G20 summit in Korea, of the importance of political leadership, of conscious political leadership on these issues, conscious communications with publics about what is going on at summits and why it's of consequence to the people, and the ordinary people in those countries, and a conscious need to communicate with parliaments to follow through on summit agendas. I think that what we found was that the G8 had a problem of being the West against the rest, and even though the G20 is a much more representative grouping of countries and peoples, that there is still a problem of those who are in, who tend to be large, rich, and powerful, and those who are out, who tend to be small, poor, and not so powerful. So there is a dynamic of how do you include the rest of the world in that, and Andy Cooper here wrote, for example, a paper for the conference in Washington on the role of regional summits and the potential for G20 summits to be a channel for regional perspectives on G20 summit issues that can be taken into account at leaders level in those summits. So that was one dimension, but there's also an internal political dimension in the countries themselves of involving civil society, the business community, trade unions, NGOs, and parliaments in the conversation about why is the leader going to the summit, what does it involve, why do we care, what interests, public interests and national interests are involved in these things. So there has to be some inclusion not only of other countries, but of other segments of national societies in these summits. What seems fairly simple is that governments should consider consulting with parliaments before they go to G20 summits, and somehow report back on implications, legislative implications of what transpired in a summit for parliamentary action at home, and even to encourage the association of parliamentarians from leading parliamentarians from G20 countries to talk together about the parliamentary aspects of summits. With civil society and the business community, it's a little bit different because you're not sure quite how to choose who should be at the table. But you have to make each country will find its own context and own way to fashion a dialogue with leaders from civil society and various segments of the nation. I think it's a very promising idea that the Koreans are being willing to actually propose it as a country that itself has been a developing country recently, but has forged ahead at such dynamic rates of growth that it now is an advanced country, a member of the OECD, and so on. So the idea here is to frame an approach to development which is quite different than the G8, which capitalizes on the presence of 10 emerging market economies in the G20 itself, who represent probably half the world's poor in these 10 countries alone because they're such large countries. So the idea would be to capture not only the external dynamics, but the internal dynamics of these economies and how domestic, internal policies and initiatives fit into a more dynamic growth pattern for the lower income countries, the smaller low income countries, and then consider the external dimensions as supportive of that, rather than as the G8 really got into a situation where it was pretty focused on aid, focused on pledges by industrial countries for public financial flows to developing countries, rather than the larger context of economic growth within the developing world, its domestic origins and spillover effects, and ways in which the external economy and external actors can support it. It's quite a different formulation. The Koreans, I think, want to focus on economic growth as an element of that, and fitting it into the framework for sustained and strong, balanced growth, which is part of the G20 process. So that development and growth are part of the same G20 agenda. I think the new dynamics are to enable this larger grouping of much more diverse economic models represented by the 20 countries than the 8, much more diverse cultural perspectives than the 8. It's a question of how to capitalize on that diversity and use it as an energy which can transform G20 summits into something that G8 summits never could be, because of the more common economic model and more common cultural dimensions among the G8 countries. And for example, I think that the interesting possibility that's presented by this increased diversity is the idea that countries would align themselves together in coalitions towards different issues in different configurations, so that in a large group like this, you have to have 6 or 8 countries that begin to drive the consensus. So that the countries that are driving the consensus on development might be different than the ones who are driving the consensus on financial regulatory reform, might be different than the coalition that's driving the consensus on IMF governance reforms, and so on. And that this would be a very healthy dynamic to have in summits, because it would mean that they're not forming alliances or blocs based on narrow geopolitical interests or ideological perspectives, but are shifting based on the substance